Hello everyone! Today we are going to be learning about plants, and specifically we're going to be learning about the evolution of plants. Now some of you might be not really plant people and are going, okay, plants don't seem to do very much, but in actuality these plants do so much, and believe it or not, plants in some ways are kind of more complicated than you are. How is that, you say? Well, just think at the cellular level. You guys remember what a plant cell looks like. It has everything we animal cells have, plus some. They got some cell walls, they have central vacuole and chloroplast, and they do lots of cool stuff like photosynthesis. How cool is that? So not only that, but plants actually have very complicated evolutionary histories, and so that's really what the topic of this lecture is. We are going to go over the evolutionary history of plants, and we can say it really is a sex out of water story. Huh? Right? Well, what do we mean by a sex out of water story? You will see. And not only did they have to learn how to do sex out of water, but they had to defy some other pretty creepy things on land. So really what this is about how did plants make the move from living in the water to living on the land? What were the challenges they faced, and what absolutely awesome evolutionary adaptations did they do to combat that? So you can see Carl Nicholas here says the movement of green plants from water to land was one of the greatest adaptive radiations in the history of life. Now, as far as we know, we don't have any Audrey 2s out there. However, we do have carnivorous plants. Venus's flytrap and pitcher plants. These guys actually eat animals. They eat insects. How cool is that? I'm sure that's where they got the idea for Little Shop of Horrors. Anyway, so let's take a look at what we're going to be studying regarding how plants made the move to land. And I got a couple jokes there for you, of course, exotic plant fast food chain, and I guess you want flies with that because these are Venus flytraps. Ha ha! Okay, anyway, so recall that there are three domains of life. So we have the prokarya, which would be the bacteria, right? We have the archaea, and everything else is in eukarya. You, me, the dog, the plant, the protist. We're all eukaryotes because we have organelles in our cell and a membrane-bound nucleus. So plants are like us. They're eukaryotes. We're bros. We're cousins. We're in the same domain. So that's what plants are. Domain eukarya, but then you'll remember the taxonomy, the phylogeny, the Linnaean classification system, right? So Dumb King Philip came over from Germany stoned. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? And so plants are in domain eukarya, but they're in kingdom Plantae. And that one's actually not too hard to remember. Plants are in Plantae. Plantae. And so we believe that that plants originally evolved in the water, and they probably evolved from green protists called algae, which you're familiar with. So algae are in kingdom Protista, domain eukarya. Kingdom Protista, they're multicellular protists, but plants evolved from them and are in a different kingdom. They're in kingdom Plantae. So keep that in mind. Protists can be unicellular, meaning single-celled, or multicellular. Plants can only be multicellular. So that's another difference between these guys. So why would these plants want to leave the water? The water advantages to living in the water. If you're a plant, if you're in the water and you need to get your sperm to your eggs, those sperm just swim right through the medium that you're in. They swim through the water. You're also floating, so you don't have to worry about how you're going to stand up like you do on land. So there's a lot of disadvantages to being on land if you don't have the correct adaptations, but there's a lot of advantages to being on land if you can get out of there. So number one, if you're in the water and everybody else is too, there's intense competition going on in that water environment. You have to compete with all the other guys to get to the top of the water because that's where the sun's going to come in. So you want to compete with these guys to get that little bit of sunlight that's coming into the water, and so there's intense competition. And so you can imagine that those that were able to leave the water to get onto land faced less competition for sunlight, for nutrients, gas exchange, all sorts of things like that. So it was kind of being able to take the move to land was a refuge against competition that would have been happening in the water. Of course, it's like the bandwagon, right? Someone gets out there, they decide it's a good idea, all of a sudden everybody else wants to go out there too. And so eventually more and more plants made their way onto land and took the competition with them. So all of a sudden you had intense competition for light on land, just like you did in the water. And that's going to drive certain adaptations like growing bigger. So again, problems with living out of the water is that, okay, everything that was easy to do in the water is now going to be hard to do. So number one, if you're not in water, then you're not in water. So how are you going to get the water, and how are you going to keep it from evaporating away? So the problems plants on land face were things like water loss. How are they going to keep from drying out? How are they going to keep from dehydrating, desiccating? Two, like I said, there's no water to float on, so you have to worry about gravity. How are you going to keep gravity from pulling you down to the ground? So you're going to have to evolve adaptations to keep you from facing that force of gravity and having it allow you to not survive. And with no water to allow your sperm to swim, how are you going to deal with sex? How are you going to get sperm to eggs? And yes, plants have sperm. How many of you guys knew that? So how are you going to get those sperm to eggs when the air is between you and the next plant? So what kinds of adaptations did plants have to evolve to deal with these issues? And while we're on the subject of plant sperm, how many of you knew that when you have allergies due to pollen, what you're really sneezing out is plant sperm? So pollen is just the case for the plant sperm. Got to be allergic to sperm. Fun. Okay, so again, to combat these problems, here's what we're going to be studying as the adaptations that plants evolved to deal with these issues. Number one, they evolved adaptations to conserve water. So if the problem is water loss, your adaptation is let's conserve the water. Two, how are they going to deal with gravity? They're going to have adaptations to defy that gravity. And of course, how are they going to reproduce on land? They're going to have adaptations allowing them to get their sperm to their eggs. So we're going to tackle each one of these and figure out how did these adaptations evolve, and when did they evolve? With which plant groups did these adaptations evolve? So here is basically what evolutionary biologists think happened in the evolution of plants. So again, we think that modern day plants evolved from photosynthetic protist algae, and that happened about 500 million years ago in the Paleozoic. So that's a long time ago. So imagine at that point you're in the water and you only have green algae. But by the time you're at about 350 million years ago, suddenly you get land plants. And these guys, the first ones were not really very large and not very spectacular. These were your non-vascular plants, like the mosses. And we'll talk in a little bit about what we mean by non-vascular, but let's just give a hint. These guys were having to face issues of gravity. And as we move on down the timeline here, you can see from non-vascular plants, you had a group emerge called the seedless vasculars. So these would be things like ferns. And from them, the conifers, the gymnosperms. So, and there's other groups besides conifers in the gymnosperms. So these are the naked seed plants. And most recently, and very close to the time that animals started to evolve, we have the angiosperms. So these angiosperms are flowering plants, and about 90% of plants out there are angiosperms. So recent arrivals in the evolutionary scheme of things, but very important arrivals, because if it wasn't for angiosperms, we animals wouldn't exist. You wouldn't be sitting there studying this right now, because most of our crops are angiosperms. We depend on things to pollinate them and so that they can fertilize, and therefore we can exist. So how'd they figure out this evolution of plants here? So here's the Cenozoic. So about 100 million years ago, we got the angiosperms. And, we humans came into the picture very, very recently, much closer to the zero on this timeline here. So some of the ways evolutionary biologists have figured out the evolution of plants, well, the classical way is comparison of morphologies. And you might recall from our evolutionary unit, morph means body, so a comparative morphology study means that they're comparing the body types or the structures of different creatures. So in this case, they're comparing the different plants in terms of the way they look, their leaves and their stems and their roots, and trying to draw an evolutionary tree based on that. And of course, they've analyzed the fossil records. So many fossils of plants out there. Plants actually fossilize fairly easily compared to animals. So pretty easy to find a lot of good plants. You'll see tons of fossils of ferns and things like that. But of course, the coolest way, my favorite way, of course I'm biased, is that they figured out the evolution of plants based on molecular evidence, DNA. So we can go in now with things like MEGA that you've learned about, go in and look exactly at the DNA of different organisms and compare them and draw evolutionary trees based on the similarities of those DNA sequences. And we've basically been able to create this evolutionary tree supported by fossils and comparative morphology, but created it directly by making molecular comparisons of these different plants and determining the evolutionary heritage of this DNA. So based on that DNA evidence, DNA sequencing, where we've actually figured out the ATCG sequence of these plants, we've drawn a nice phylogenetic tree. So this is a phylogenetic tree, and the way you read this thing is down here is the oldest ancestor to everything else on the tree. So this is our common ancestor that gave rise to all of these other guys right here. And so you can see the oldest group are the red algae. So you can still go find red algae. These guys are out on the beach. These are not plants. These are protists. So all the seaweeds, all these guys are algae. So we had the red algae and some other kinds of algae here. The most recent algae that we believe is the last group, their ancestor that we shared a common ancestor with, that gave rise to all the plants. Okay, so these are your algae. These guys are the green algae right here. So this is the closest algal relative, the corallis, and it gave rise, boom, to everything else around here. So the groups of plants we're going to talk about, so probably the most, I'll put quotation marks, primitive plant group, although I really don't like that term primitive. It really means evolved the longest ago compared to present day. That would be this group right here. So these are the bryophytes. So we got mosses and hornworts and liverworts. And I'll show you pictures of these guys. Further on down, meaning closer to modern day, although modern day being like 300 million years ago, we had this group of plants, so the lycophytes, whisk ferns, horsetails, and ferns, which are still plenty present today. You see these guys around. We also see horsetails. We see all these guys here. They're not extinct, but there's not as many examples as there used to be. And most recently, we have the gymnosperms here, which include the conifers, like our pine trees, and the very most recent plants, the angiosperms. So this is kind of a different way of drawing what we just talked about in that last slide. But what's the most cool, I think, about this slide is it shows you when different adaptations evolved to deal with these problems that these plants faced when they got to land. So notice this is what we call a monophyletic tree. That means that all this originated from a common ancestor. There's one phylogeny. Mono means one. So this is a monophyletic tree. But here you can see these different traits that evolved at different times in the evolution of plants. And so we're going to be talking about each of these. So the very first thing that was kind of a key innovation that allowed for the evolution of plants to take place. If this thing hadn't happened, probably plants wouldn't be here, which means you wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be here. And that was the evolution of spores and zygotes that were encased in a protective covering. Okay, so you got the evolution of protected spores, zygotes, you remember, as a fertilized egg. But this happens still in the algae. So between the move from this ovobionta to these green algae here, that was a key innovation. Further on down, before plants actually evolved, so before this first group of what we call non-vascular plants, these guys, by the time we left the sea, so algae were in the ocean, the first land plants had to deal first and foremost with how do you deal with lack of water. And so they dealt with these through the adaptations of evolving cuticles, pores, and stomata. And so we're going to talk about each of these and what was what was involved with those. And then before we get to the next group, we have the evolution of vascular tissue. And this is very key because if it wasn't for the vascular tissue, the plants wouldn't have been able to combat gravity. And if they couldn't combat gravity, they would never grow very big. And so this would be a very different looking world than what we have today. There would be no trees, for example. And so as things start growing bigger, thanks to vascular tissue, you get the need for more nutrients. And so we get the evolution of roots and the ability to move water and nutrients around. So we get the evolution of tracheids. And in the most recent groups, sort of advanced tracheids called vessels. So we're going to go over each of these adaptations, but they're awesome adaptations, and they were so important. If they didn't happen when they happened, we animals could not have existed. Okay, so we said that plants are in domain Eukarya, kingdom Plantae, and now going back down on the Linnaean scale there, you know that the next thing is phylum. And so it turns out that there are 12 phyla of plants. So domain Eukarya, kingdom Plantae, and then 12 phyla. And we can take these 12 phyla and put them into 3 main groups. And in terms of evolutionary adaptations, these 3 main groups are the non-vascular plants, as we said. So that means they have no vascular tissue. And you might be like, what is vascular tissue? Well, think of your vascular tissue. What is it for? What is it? Well, you got to get your blood moving around your body. And so we have arteries and we have veins. Well, plants don't have blood, but they have something kind of analogous to it, something similar. They have to get their fluids, their sugars, and their nutrients and their water up and down the plant. And so they have to have something kind of like blood vessels, like arteries and veins that we have, but they have vascular tissue, so made from cells, and we'll go over vascular tissue in more detail. So the first plants didn't grow very tall. They were really low to the ground. These are your liverworts, which you see right here, your hornworts that you see right there, and what most people are familiar with in this non-vascular group, the mosses. So, you know, moss is that green, damp stuff that's in nice, damp forests. So these are your non-vascular plants, and they're all really close to the ground. And so if you're close to the ground, water is right there. It's not going to go very far. It's easy to get nutrients moved around from the soil into the plant. And so you really didn't need non-vascular tissue when you first came out of the water onto the land. However, as these guys are all getting to the land at the same time, they're all competing for light, they're starting to realize that, well, not consciously, of course, but evolution's going to favor ones that grow taller than the others because they'll have an advantage for reaching that light and not being able to actually exploit resources that the guys that are lower to the ground can't do. And so this leads to the evolution of the next of the 3 groups, and this is the seedless vascular group. So this includes these guys. These are lycophytes. You can sometimes buy these in freshwater aquarium pet stores to put in your aquaria. We also have the ferns, which most people are familiar with. Everybody knows what a fern is. This is a whisk fern, and these, one of my favorites, these are horsetails. And the horsetails are so cool because they're fun to play with. They come in these big things. They look like straws. They're hollow inside, and you can break off the little parts. You can use them like straws. Anyway, they're actually kind of a primitive plant. These are seedless vascular because they were the ones that invented the vascular tissue. These guys had vascular tissue. That means they had specialized cells that were able to kind of pull stuff up and push stuff down. So they have vascular tissue, and we'll go over what those are a little bit later. But they didn't have seeds. So they had spores, but no seeds. And in fact, you've probably picked up a fern plant before. And if you look at the underside of a fern plant, you can see spores. You can see things that give rise to spores. And those are all over the underside of a fern, but there's no seeds. So there's not a lot of protection to the developing embryo, which can be problematic if you're in the dog-eat-dog world of the land. So finally, the third group are the seeded vascular groups. And there's 5 groups within the seeded vascular group. So we have cycads. These are they look like palm trees, but they're actually very far removed evolutionarily from palm trees. Palm trees are angiosperms. These guys are not. They do not produce flowers, but they're kind of cool. And, you might have seen them in Jurassic Park for whatever reason. And then we have things called, this is a ginkgo. And in fact, most of the species of ginkgos are extinct. There's actually only one species that I know of still living, and this is you can buy them in the nursery. It's sort of a decorative plant. The conifers are the pine trees. Everybody knows what a pine tree is. Christmas trees, for example. And this is a netophyte. These guys live in Africa. We don't usually see much of them around here. But the final group, of course, is the most common group today, and the ones we all love, we give to our loved ones on Valentine's Day, and these are the angiosperms, the flowering plants. So 3 groups: non-vascular, seedless vascular, and seeded vascular. So you can see that we're having both an evolution of vascular tissue and, all right, dealing with the lack of water. So remember, the first adaptations for dealing with lack of water when plants got to land, that happened with our non-vascular plants. They were really the first to deal with how do you keep from drying out when you get to a land where there's not much water going on. And so they had some very ingenious adaptations, one of which is the cuticle. So you've probably heard of cuticle if you've gotten manicures, and it's kind of the same idea, but really it's different. So in a plant, the cuticle is the waxy covering over the leaves, this nice waxy covering over the leaves, hold water in. And really early in the fossil record of plants, you see evidence of cuticles. So we know it was one of the first adaptations that plants were able to inherit. Okay, great. You're waterproof, right? You got this nice wax over your leaves and you're good to go, right? Wrong, because it's not just about water. You also have to get gas exchange there, right? You got to get carbon dioxide in and oxygen out. How are you going to do that if you're covered with wax? Those gases won't be able to get across that leaf. Duh, right? So these guys had to evolve adaptations to allow for that gas exchange to occur. And it was genius. Now, some of the first more early or primitive plants to deal with this evolved basically little holes in their leaves. They're like, okay, let's poke some holes in our leaves and we'll be able to get gas in and out. Of course, they didn't really poke holes in their leaves. Those that had the holes, called pores, were at a selective advantage, and so it got passed on. And so pores, all they are really are holes in the leaves. So little holes. Okay, so they're little holes in the leaves. And we say, okay, that's great, right? We got pores. We can get oxygen out of the leaves after photosynthesis, and we can get carbon dioxide into dry photosynthesis, but you can't regulate it. If it's just a hole, you can't control how much of those gases is going in and out. So we needed something else, right? Necessity is the mother of invention. And thanks to some mutation allowing this to happen and selective processes and all those evolutionary processes, we get stomata. And they have the pores, but you get the evolution of these amazing cells surrounding those pores. So see this and that's called a guard cell. So guard cells surround the pores and they can expand and contract. And so this, plants don't have muscles, so that they can't use muscles for this, but they have cells that can fill, with fluid or retract. And for that reason, they can regulate whether those pores are open or closed. And so this structure right here, and then there's more cells surrounding it. This is called an epidermal cell on the outside. This is called a stomata. Stomata. So stomata evolved to allow for the exchange of gases. So here the stoma. So stoma is singular, stomata is plural. So this stoma is open here and it's closed here. And so these plants, thanks to the guard cells allowing the evolution of stomata, these guys were able to evolve a way of controlling gas exchange. Very, very important for life on Earth. So again, the earliest plants, these non-vasculars, we actually see just the pores. So we see stomata present in the mosses and the horsetails, but the liverworts of that group had the pores but no guard cells. So you kind of see this evolution of guard cells creating ultimately the nicely evolved stomata. Cool or what? And these are all on the underside of leaves. You can pick a leaf and go and look at it, and, peel back some of it. Look under the microscope. You'll see stomata. Okay, so we have fixed the problem of drying out, and we fixed the problem of gas exchange, but we have this problem of defying gravity. So this might have been something like what the early Earth looked like when plants first evolved on land. And you notice there's a lot of competition. And so originally all these guys were low to the ground because they hadn't evolved the ability to defy gravity. But as competition took place for sunlight, those that could grow taller would have been able to get more light and had a selective advantage. And you even still see this today with, just take weeds, for example. They're in a scramble to grow as fast as they can, as high as they can to get to the sunlight before the next guy does. Or if you've been to a forest and a tree falls down, there's a little clearing, all these new plants will just come in like crazy to try to get to the sunlight before everybody else does. But we have to defy gravity here. So, the algae that were in the water was a lot denser than the algae. So the algae floated. There was no need to defy gravity because you were floating. But once you got to land, you faced this problem of how do you grow taller, because we need to grow taller to avoid competition to get to the sunlight. But how do you do it when gravity's pushing down on you and you're a floppy plant? How are you going to stay upright? Well, for one thing, there's water, right? I've found out the hard way. If I don't water my plants, they don't defy gravity anymore, and down they go. So obviously, there's some way of getting water through the plant that's going to help it to stay upright. But this idea that the first plants to reach land were low growing, they were low to the ground, is called the sprawling growth hypothesis. And they wanted to be low to the ground, right? Because you wanted to make sure that there was moisture there. These guys had to get sperm to eggs without water surrounding them to do it. And so if they could stay low to the ground, they were near soil, which was nice and moist, and they'd have an easier time of doing that. But if everybody's doing it, you have intense competition for light, and therefore evolution towards growing upright, and eventually you get something that looks like that. We're going to talk about some of these amazing adaptations these guys had for going against gravity. How do you get water from the soil up to the tree against gravity? And some of you might be familiar with redwood trees. I mean, redwood trees are the tallest organism in the world. Some of these guys, there's one that's 370 feet in the air. Oh my gosh, 370 feet tall. How do you get water from the soil way up there? Well, it turns out that redwood trees are kind of unique. They actually can absorb some water from the mist in the air, but they also take advantage of the same adaptation the rest of the plant world took advantage of to get water to go against gravity. And how do they keep from falling over? Okay, so let's talk about some of the adaptations these plants had to defy gravity. And these are just the key innovations that allowed the gymnosperms and later on the angiosperms to grow tall and allow for life on Earth to progress. So you might have heard things called xylem and phloem. These are kind of like, it's almost like the information railroad tracks for the tree, except instead of information, they're transporting water, nutrients, and in the case of phloem, sugars throughout the tree. Now, normally, if you just let gravity take effect, there would be no way you could get water to go from the soils up to the tops of the tree and all the leaves and everywhere it needs to go. But thanks to the invention of vascular tissue, we're able to go against gravity and take that water from the soil to the top of the trees. Now, the gymnosperms you often hear of these guys, the conifers, called softwoods. And the reason why is because the xylem that they have, X-Y-L-E-M, that xylem that carries the water from the roots up through the shoots, through the top part, that xylem is composed of cells called tracheids. And these tracheids are more, I guess you could say, primitive than what the angiosperms have. They're kind of simple, but they serve to bring that water from the soil on up. As you went through evolutionary time and you got the evolution of the hardwoods, the angiosperms, these guys had very complex xylem cells, and we call these vessels or vessel elements. And so these guys just kind of stack on each other, and they serve kind of like straws, capillary action to really get that water from the soil on up. So marvelous inventions, these vascular tissues. And so what we show here is an electron micrograph of the tracheids. They evolved about 380 million years ago. And not only are these vascular tissues helping to get water and nutrients up against gravity through the tree, but they also provide support. So if it wasn't for the cell walls on these cells, the plants would just go against gravity. So the cell walls are rigid, and in fact the vessel elements have much stronger cell walls than what the tracheids did, and you can actually see later tracheids having better strength than the early tracheids. But plants also use something called turgor pressure, just the water that's inside the cells to help maintain them upright, which is why if you don't water your plants, they bleh. But anyway, so vascular tissue, very cool. These become analogous to our blood vessels. So this is showing you a picture of the more highly evolved, again, I hate that term highly versus primitive, but anyway, these tracheids basically evolved into more complex structures called vessels. And so you see a xylem here consisting of these vessel cells, and they serve capillary action to just bring water up the tree. So this is the most efficient water transport system here. Okay, so if we look back at the monophylogeny here in the evolution of plants, you can see that the tracheids evolved as an innovation along with roots to some of the higher plants that included vasculars that were the gymnosperms, and the more complex ones were with the hardwoods, the angiosperms, and those were called vessels. Okay, so this brings us to the final problem. How did plants deal with sex out of the water? No water for your little sperm to swim in to reach the egg. We have air instead. So how do you combat that? How do you get your sperm to your eggs when you have air to deal with? So land plants, total geniuses. Innovation 1 to deal with the problem of sex out of water. Alternation of generations. Alteration of generations. Wow, what in the world is that? Well, this is their reproductive life cycle. And if you think about the reproductive life cycle of we humans and other animals, it's kind of simple, right? You've already learned about mitosis and meiosis. So, let's start with a diploid zygote. So this is humans. We have a diploid zygote, right? Sperm and eggs liked each other and came together, and you get a baby. What will be the baby, right? You get the diploid zygote. So we were 2 in. And then that zygote divides, and those cells divide, and those cells divide, and you get a ball of cells, which eventually start growing into an embryo and a fetus and a baby, and that happens all through the process of mitosis. But those cells are still diploid, and it's not until, like in the case of males, it's not until puberty that the certain diploid cells in the male testes will undergo meiosis to produce sperm, the gametes. And then, same thing happened in the female, which started actually as an embryo, and boom, they fertilize and you get a diploid zygote again. So that's the life cycle of animals like humans. Plants are more complicated than animals. They have a couple extra steps there. And so what you're going to see is a progression over evolutionary time. As plants got more complex, they started kind of switching their strategies around, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So we have here what's called the gametophyte stage, and it's a haploid stage, and we have the sporophyte stage, and this is a diploid stage. So if we can kind of look at this chart right here, let's start with a zygote. So yes, plants do sex. Yes, plants have sperm, and they have eggs. Go figure, right? In fact, did you know when you eat a fruit like a peach, you're biting into a plant ovary? Yum. And of course, we're allergic to plant sperm in the form of pollen. Anyway, I digress. So when the sperm and the egg come together, they make a zygote just like in an animal, just like us. And that zygote is going to start growing into an embryo, but eventually it becomes what's called a sporophyte. So a sporophyte, what it is depends on what kind of plant you're talking about. So if you take a look at this guy, this is a moss right here. The moss, the sporophytes are these little stalky things right here. Those are the sporophytes. But if you go out and you look at a tree, what you see, the tree itself, you know, with the trunk and the branches and the leaves, that's your sporophyte. Whoa! Sporophytes really changed over evolutionary time. They went from these little puny looking things right here in the mosses to whole friggin' redwoods, right? And so sporophytes have undergone some intensive evolution there. When you see most of the plants out there, you're looking at sporophytes. So the sporophytes are diploid, and they give rise to things called sporangia. And sporangia are kind of like mother cells. They're diploid, and they're going to undergo meiosis. Sporangia undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores. So we're in the haploid part of the life cycle now. So these haploid spores are not gametes. This is where it gets confusing, because you're thinking, okay, we should be at sperm and eggs by now if this was an animal. No, plants do some extra stuff. They get these haploid spores through meiosis, which will develop into a gametophyte. So in the mosses, that's this stuff here. But it's what makes a moss, right? That green stuff, that's the gametophyte. But it's only those non-vascular plants that you really see this predominant gametophyte, the gametophyte being more predominant than the sporophytes. Later on, like even when you get to things like the ferns, the seedless vasculars, you don't see a gametophyte. Ferns have gametophytes, but they're microscopic. They're microscopic. You have to have a microscope to see them. The whole plant, the whole fern, what you see is the sporophyte. And then that trend must have been successful because it just continued on. By the time you get to the gymnosperms, the gametophyte is actually inside the pine cones. You can't see it. It's inside the pine cones. The rest of the tree is the sporophyte. Now, as if that wasn't cool enough, these gametophytes then undergo mitosis to produce the gametes. So the gametophyte gives rise to gametes, sperm and eggs. And in the case of pine trees, there are actually male pine cones and female pine cones. The male pine cones contain the gametophyte that will produce the male gametes, the sperm, and the female pine cones contain the gametophytes that will produce the female gametes, the eggs. And so those are produced from mitosis from the gametophyte. They come together, they fuse, gamete fusion, i.e. sex, and you get a zygote. Sex out of water in plants. Very cool. Okay, so as we're talking about the evolution of plants to land and their issue with how to have sex out of water, all right, so we learned about the alternation of generations. That was innovation number one. But, okay, so now you can produce your eggs and your sperm. We know the gametophytes are getting small and the sporophytes are getting big over evolutionary time. But now what do you do with your babies? Because primitive plants didn't really have to worry when they're in the water. They didn't really have to worry about how to nourish their baby and protect their baby because the babies were in water. Food was readily available. Everything was okay. But now that you're in this, dog eat dog life on land, you got to protect your babies. So again, in the water, didn't have to worry so much. But once they got to land, they did. And so innovation number two for our sex out of water story, retention and nourishment of offspring. Protect them, nourish them, keep them going. So back in the water, when we're dealing before plants, when we're dealing with the green algae, the corallis, their embryos actually ate decaying debris from their parents. So their parents would die and they'd actually start eating the decaying stuff. So the parents weren't actively trying to nourish the babies. They weren't putting any energy into the nourishment of the babies. The babies just ate their parents when they died. Kind of creepy, huh? Well, by the time you got to land, it was important that the babies were cared for by their parents in some way, the baby plants. The plants had to directly provide nourishment to the babies. And so they actually had embryonic transfer cells. They would actually transfer some of the the nourishment to the babies. You also saw the evolution of gametangia in these seedless land plants, and these were ways of protecting the gametes themselves. So this would prevent drying from happening. So it prevents drying of the gametes, the sperm or the eggs. It also provides protection. So in the sperm, they evolved gametangia called antheridia, and in eggs, they evolved a protective gametangia called archegonia. So these seeds were now, not the seeds, the gametes were now protected. But the problem is these antheridia and archegonia often occurred on the same gametophyte, which means they would often fertilize with each other, which means if they came from the same parent, you're talking about intensive inbreeding. So inbreeding is a bad thing. You can get inbreeding depression in a population, which means the organisms are less vigorous, less viable. They have weaker immune systems and lowered fertility. So even plants can inbreed, and even plants don't like to inbreed. So they're going to have adaptations to help get their babies or their gametes away from the parents. You don't want to be mating with your parents or your siblings. So how are you going to get these gametes taken away? Da, 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 da. We have the evolution of pollen. So innovation number 3 in our Sex Out of Water story, the innovation of pollen. And this is basically the gametophyte. So in these higher organisms, in the angiosperms, you had evolution of separate male gametophytes and female gametophytes. And in the case of pollen, that is the male gametophyte. And you can see here an electron micrograph of a pollen grain, a pollen granule. So this guy's small, that little much is 20 micrometers, 20 millionths of a meter. The cool thing about pollen is it houses the sperm. So remember, gametophytes undergo mitosis to produce the gametes. And so the sperm are actually inside of this pollen grain. And with this nice protective pollen coat, it's protected from the elements. And therefore, it can be free to go off away from the parents to find its own fortune and not have to worry about being degraded by air. Now, how are you going to get that sperm, that pollen grain? How are you going to get it away from the parents? You're going to have something to carry it away. So the first pollen granules were carried away by wind, and we still have many wind-pollinated plants to this day, such as grasses. But the cool part of the story is where you get the evolution of mechanisms to encourage animals, such as insects, to carry your pollen away. So really, insects they're kind of the matchmakers, but they're helping these plants to avoid inbreeding by carrying the pollen to other plants where they can fertilize other plant eggs. So our innovation of number 4 is the evolution of seeds. Number 3 was the pollen to avoid inbreeding, and we'll get back to pollen when we talk about flowers. But innovation number 4 was the evolution of seeds. And so there are 5 phyla that are seed-bearing. Remember, this was that third group, and it included the angiosperms. So really all a seed is, everybody knows, you probably had seeds with your breakfast this morning. Seeds are actually the plant embryo. It's the plant embryo with a tough protective layer that includes fluid and nourishment for this developing embryo. So it's kind of analogous to like a chicken egg, right? Chicken egg has a hard outer shell, and then of course inside is the cytoplasm, which includes the nutrients and the water. And if it's fertilized, a baby will grow, and it will grow inside that shell. Same thing with a seed. How many of you knew that plants had embryos? How crazy is that? Plants do have embryos. And so these embryos need to be nourished and protected, and that's what a seed does for it. So what's cool is that the gametophytes, as you get to the angiosperms, the gametophyte becomes hidden. And it's actually hidden inside the flower. And so you're going to produce male gametes and female gametes within a single flower. But by having these seeds, that's going to help with dispersal because the baby is protected, so it can be taken far away from its parent, again, to avoid inbreeding. And some plants have very interesting seeds where they'll grow little contraptions that are kind of like little windmills to help them catch the wind and disperse as far away from the parents as possible. kind of like kicking the teenager out from the house when they're 18. But the nice thing is, if you have a seed, you don't require any extra water to get that egg fertilized. So very, very valuable. Okay, so we want to avoid inbreeding. So we've invented a seed. So we've been able to make sure that our babies are protected, or the plant babies, right? Plant babies are protected and nourished. All is good. And they're ready to go on their merry way to find a mate somewhere else so that you avoid inbreeding. Well, you got to have someone to help you do that. You have to have a pollinator to help carry the seed to where it needs to go, carry sperm to eggs. And so we get innovation number 5, which is the evolution of flowers, and hence the evolution of the angiosperms. So the angiosperms are flowering plants, and that makes up 90% of plants on Earth. To date, we've identified about 250,000 species of these guys. And of course, they're awesome because they produce flowers. Who doesn't like a flower, right? This was the revolutionary evolutionary breakthrough. So here's a flower, here's also a flower, and here's a flower. So these guys have no gametangia. Their gametes are directly produced by male or female gametophytes. So you get male and female parts here. And it's so cool. You know, like some of these flowers have adapted to be pollinated by birds. Those tend to be orange or red and have no smell because birds can't smell. So don't put your ATP to producing fragrance when what you need is can't even smell you. And some of these guys, I mean, look how it becomes tubular, perfect for the beak of a hummingbird, or in the case of Hawaii, a honeycreeper. So you know that when you see something like this, you know that's bird pollinated. Some of the colors, like the purples and the blues, are very fragrant, and they're usually pollinated by things like bees or wasps. This guy right here, this is a carrion flower. He looks like carrion, like dead, rotting meat. And guess what he smells like? Dead, rotting meat. And guess who he needs to pollinate him? He attracts flies, because the flies are going to go there thinking they're going to lay their eggs on a nice juicy meal for their babies, and they end up getting pollen grains stuck on them. And when they fly to the next flower, those pollen grains get put into the female part, which you have the ovary connected to what's called a style and a stigma at the end. So the pollen gets stuck on the stigma, and the sperm actually will then exit the pollen grain and go down into the style and reach the ovary, ovule, which is the egg of the flower, and that's where the zygote baby is produced. And eventually that ovary will mature, and in many angiosperms will become a fruit. So just so cool. Very, very cool. And so looking at the amazing adaptations that all the different diversity of flowers on this earth have to attracting pollinators is quite fascinating. And so this is called the directed pollination hypothesis, that there's this constant evolutionary coevolution going on where the flower evolves ways of attracting the pollinator, and then the pollinator will pollinate that flower, which drives further adaptation towards that specific pollinator. And so you can see that only a bird can pollinate these kinds of flowers right here. And there's even cases like the yucca moth, which there's only one species of insect, the yucca moth, that can pollinate a yucca plant. And if you lose one, you lose the other. So that certainly has implications for conservation. Okay, I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the evolution of plants. We're on to the next group. Take care.